Okay, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for joining us for part 3 of 5 of our Zoom webinar series that we entitled, as you can see there, Watering Wisdom, Growing a Healthy Lawn with Less Water. So as I just mentioned, today we're going to be doing part 3, which is going to be covering turfgrass species for low input Minnesota lawns. But before we get started, as we have the last couple of presentations, we just want to remind you of our future webinars coming up. So 3 weeks from now, September 8th, we'll be going over lawn care best management practices. And then our final webinar will be September 29th, and we'll be focusing on winterizing your lawn. And just a quick overview of how to use Zoom. So the Q&A function is where you will ask questions to our panelists. I'm Shane Evans. I'll be one of the panelists. We also have Dr. Eric Watkins from the University of Minnesota. He will be our presenter today. And we also have Brian Davis from the Metropolitan Council. So if at any time during the presentation, just hover your mouse over that little Q&A bubble that you see, and a window, as you see on the right, should pop up. And right there, that's where you can type your questions. And again, we'll be answering those at the end of the webinar, but feel free to type them in at any point during the presentation. The chat will be disabled, but you can still ask questions. So with that brief introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Eric Watkins. He's our presenter for today. So with that, Brian, feel free to, or excuse me, Eric, feel free to take over.
Thanks, Shane. So yes, I'm Watkins professor at the University of Minnesota, and my research program is focused on turfgrass breeding and genetics and selection of turfgrasses for different environments. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So there's a lot of ways you can save water on a lawn, but I think one of the best ways to reduce watering on home lawns is through using the right grass in the right place. So we're going to talk about some of the attributes of the different turf grasses you can use in Minnesota, and then discuss a few things related to their various stress tolerances and some of the ways they handle drought conditions. So you hear the term low input lawn, that can mean a lot of things. You might imagine something like the picture on the left. That's a no-mow fine fescue. I think for most people this would be far too low input, but some people might consider this a useful lawn in a low input situation. And then on the right we have an example of some research plots of fine fescue where you can see they're mowed. They look pretty good. The color is good, but you can see there's quite a bit of clover. So in this case, we aren't using herbicides to control the clover, and this is also, this might also be considered a low input lawn. In this situation, we're reducing the inputs of herbicides. So when you think about the inputs that go into a lawn and the inputs that we want to reduce, water would be a big one, and that's the focus of this webinar series. Reducing fertilizer use. Sometimes this could be there could be economic reasons. Maybe you want to reduce your costs of lawn care. But also some environmental reasons. We don't want to be overusing fertilizers. There can be some issues with runoff of certain fertilizers into our water bodies. So you want to reduce fertilizer as much as possible while maintaining a good, healthy lawn. We want to reduce pesticides. So like the picture on the right, reduce, using grasses that maybe don't need as many fungicides for disease or as many herbicides for weed control. Then I think a really big one is mowing. You can really reduce, with some of these grasses at least, you can reduce the number of times you have to mow during the season, and that can be a big savings in both time and money as well in terms of equipment and fuel. So when you think about the primary turf grasses we might suggest for Minnesota lawns, there's a number of options. I've listed the main options here. So this list includes pretty much everything that is currently used on Minnesota lawns. We do research on other grasses that might be used on lawns someday. There are also some other grasses like buffalo grass that occasionally get used, but these are the primary, like, typically used available grasses for Minnesota lawns. We do research on all of these species at our research center on the St. Paul campus at the university, which is pictured on the right. So we'll go through each of these, talk a little bit about their attributes, some of the things that they provide that are positives for a lawn, and then also some negative attributes. And then after this, we'll talk in more detail about comparing the different grasses for their ability to handle certain types of stress. So first we'll go through Kentucky bluegrass, then perennial ryegrass. Those are probably the two most popular, common turf grasses currently in Minnesota. Then we'll talk about tall fescue, which is gaining in popularity, but it's still pretty rare. And then fine fescues, a group of grasses that do get used, but we think are quite underutilized, and I think you'll see why later in the presentation. So Kentucky bluegrass, most people are familiar with Kentucky bluegrass. It's the most popular turf grass in the northern U.S. It makes a really nice lawn. It's used in golf courses, especially golf course roughs. Large parks are very often Kentucky bluegrass. It's a good grass for athletic fields, and it looks really good. When conditions are favorable and maintenance is done correctly and the inputs are at the level it needs, it provides a really nice turf cover. It's got very good recuperative ability, so if it gets damaged, it's got rhizomatous growth habits, so underground stems that fill in bare spots with new plants. It's very winter hardy. That's one of the main reasons you see it so often used in the northern U.S. Doesn't really have any problems during the winter. Its mowing quality is very good, so it mows very clean. There's very little damage to the leaf when mowing occurs. And perhaps the biggest one is it's available readily in seed or by seed or sod. So a lot of people want the advantages provided by sod, and laying sod and getting an instant lawn without having to go through the process of seeding is a big advantage for a lot of people. Some of the negatives of Kentucky bluegrass, I really don't consider this a very drought tolerant species. It does survive drought, so it has this dormancy mechanism. So during drought periods in the summer, as many of you have observed probably in your lawns, it'll go dormant, so off color, turns brown, and then when rain returns, it is back to being green. You can see a picture on the right that shows a difference between non-irrigated Kentucky bluegrass in the foreground and irrigated Kentucky bluegrass in the background here in the back. You can see there's a big difference. So this non-irrigated turf grass, Kentucky bluegrass stand, is starting to go dormant, and it's not going to have the same quality that the irrigated Kentucky bluegrass is going to have. Its heat stress tolerance is not great. That is not a huge problem in Minnesota, but it could be problems in certain environments, maybe next to roads or areas where temperatures are a little bit higher for whatever reason. In general, shade performance is not very good. So in situations where you have a lot of trees or where shade is an issue, we recommend other species. There are some exceptions with a few cultivars of Kentucky bluegrass that are more shade tolerant, but in general, the species is not very tolerant of shade. Also, it gets a number of diseases in Minnesota, and creating a situation where if you're not controlling some of those diseases, that you can end up with a reduced quality turf as well. Now, of course, plant breeders over the years have developed a lot of really nice cultivars of Kentucky bluegrass that have better disease resistance than the old cultivars, but this is still a problem in many of the cultivars of Kentucky bluegrass that you might use on a home lawn. So now we'll move on to perennial ryegrass. This is used in many seed mixes. So almost every seed mix you purchase is going to have some perennial ryegrass in it. And one of the reasons it's added to these seed mixes is because it has very quick germination, and it also establishes very well. So it comes up very quickly. So in a situation where you're worried about soil erosion during establishment, having perennial ryegrass or something to germinate very quickly is a nice advantage. I would say that oftentimes, though, in home lawn seed mixtures in Minnesota, the percentage of perennial ryegrass is much too high. If you're going to add it for these purposes, research seems to suggest maybe 20-25% maximum by weight. And a lot of the mixes you see in the store will have higher percentage than that. So this is common in home lawns, parks, athletic fields is very common, some golf course fairways around the U.S. It's got pretty good wear tolerance. Another reason it's used a lot in sports fields, like football fields, is the rapid germination and establishment allows for recovery in between games. So if you've got a football game and then 2 weeks later you have a game, you have some time for the new seed to come in. It's got a lot of negatives, however, in Minnesota. The number one negative is its winter hardiness is just not very good. So over time, you're going to have a reduction in quality through that turf being killed off a little bit each winter. And there's a number of ways that turf can die from winter stresses. There's diseases in the winter, snow molds, there's just low temperature kill, there's ice cover, and perennial ryegrass is susceptible to all of those. So it doesn't really matter which winter stress we're under, it's usually going to be affected. Unfortunately, it also has a lot of summer stress tolerance problems. So its heat stress tolerance isn't very good, its drought stress tolerance isn't very good, and it gets a lot of diseases. So its positives are very positive. It has quick germination, quick establishment. I've listed it also as endophyte infection, which is an endophyte is a fungus that lives inside the plant and can give some good insect tolerance to the plant. But overall, for Minnesota, we don't recommend this, especially when thinking about water conservation. Tall fescue is a grass you may not have heard a lot about for home lawns in Minnesota. It's used quite extensively elsewhere, especially south of here. First used as a turf in the 40s and 50s, and the quality of these early varieties was not very good. But breeders in the late 70s, early 80s started to develop really nice varieties of tall fescue, and some of the newer varieties with the leaf texture being less coarse actually look somewhat similar to Kentucky bluegrass. So this is used a lot in home lawns. It can be used effectively in athletic fields, golf course roughs, and it's a really good grass for parks where there's a lot of wear and traffic from activities, because the leaf texture of this grass really lends itself to surviving well under wear and traffic tolerance. So, the water use of tall fescue is actually no different really than some other grasses that need a lot of water. However, tall fescue roots go much deeper in the soil, and because of that, it really acts quite drought tolerant in Minnesota. So it would be quite difficult to have a summer where the tall fescue was showing severe effects of drought. Usually it stays pretty green in our environment during the summer because it's able to capture soil deep in the soil profile. Like I said before, its wear tolerance is pretty good. It doesn't get a lot of diseases, but one negative is its slow spring green up in the winter after winter. And one of the reasons one of the things that lends or contributes to that slow green up is it gets quite a bit of snow mold. So that would be the one major disease it gets in Minnesota. You can see a picture of snow mold damage here on the right. Also, just perceptions. A lot of people think of tall fescue as a weedy species or something that's only grown in the South. So the perceptions have kind of limited its use. But we're seeing more and more use of this. I don't recommend it anywhere where you have the risk of standing water during the winter. So we get these situations during the winter where we get snow melt and standing water. We want to avoid tall fescue in those areas because of its susceptibility to ice cover damage. Fine fescues is a group of grasses that we've worked on for a number of years here at the university, and we're really doing research on these in all kinds of contexts, including roadsides and golf course greens and, of course, home lawns. So they're a very versatile group of grasses. They do pretty well in shade or sun, and they really have good drought tolerance. They have a slow vertical growth rate, which is a really big advantage when thinking about one of those low input turfgrass attributes we talked about at the beginning, the reduced mowing frequency. There's two types. So when people who know about fine fescues often think of them as a very bunchy grass. So they plant it and they get these bunches of grass forming in their lawns. So there are two types of fine fescues, and we're going to kind of divide them up into bunch types and rhizomatous. There's other ways that we can divide these scientifically, but I think for this purpose, for home lawns, we can kind of think of them in two ways: bunch types and rhizomatous. Now, just because it's called a bunch type does not mean this grass is going to form clumps. If established properly and given the right fertilizer at the right time early on in its establishment, it'll do quite well and fill in and provide a really good lawn. What this is referring to is its growth habits. So bunch type grasses expand by forming new tillers from the original plant, and rhizomatous plants send out rhizomes that shoot up new plants. So really what happens is bunch type grasses just fill in a little more slowly than rhizomatous grasses usually. So these are the 5 fine fescues that we usually think of for use as lawn grasses in Minnesota. The top 3, and in this table I have them categorized a little differently. So in this table I've shown that there are 3 from the red fescue group and 2 from the sheep fescue group. So we have strong creeping red fescue, slender creeping red fescue, and chewings fescue. And then we have hard fescue and sheep fescue. And these all look fairly similar. For the most part, you're not going to be able to quickly tell them apart when you see them. They perform fairly similar, but each of them has some attributes that make it unique and useful in a turfgrass situation. So the 3 of these that do not have tillers, do not have rhizomes, are hard fescue, chewings fescue, and sheep fescue. And of these, I would say hard fescue is probably the top performer in Minnesota for low input lawns. It's got very good turf quality, very drought tolerant, and a really nice green color during the summer. When I go through the research plots at this time of year, even though it's difficult to tell fine fescues apart other times of the year, it's very apparent which ones are hard fescue because of their excellent performance. There's hardly anything wrong with the plot, even during a summer stress period. Chewings fescues are very aggressive, so they fill in very quickly, even though they're a bunch type. In fact, they can outcompete other grasses fairly well. They really seem to keep weeds out well. And the chewings fescues have some of the best shade tolerance, especially the shade that's under a tree, so foliar shade tolerance of the fine fescues. Sheep fescue you may run into once in a while. This is really the lowest maintenance of the grasses, but typically not recommended for lawns. You can use it for lawns, but there's not a great number of varieties available, and also the color is kind of a bluish green, which some people don't care for. The rhizomatous types are strong creeping red fescue and slender creeping red fescue. And strong creeping red fescue is the one that's going to be the most easy to find of all of these 5 fine fescues. So you go to the store and look for grass seed, you're going to see a lot of strong creeping red fescue mixed into the mixtures that are available for home lawns. Oftentimes it's mixed with Kentucky bluegrass. It's got good shade tolerance. So in a situation where it's mixed with Kentucky bluegrass, you might expect that the Kentucky bluegrass will do better in the sun and the strong creeping red fescue will do better in the shade. Of the 5 fine fescues, however, this is probably the poorest performing in terms of summer stress in Minnesota. It gets a few diseases like dollar spot and red thread more severely under disease pressure than the other grasses. It also doesn't have as good heat stress tolerance as the other fine fescues. Slender creeping red fescue is also a very good grass, similar to hard fescue in terms of its performance in Minnesota. One of the problems with slender creeping red fescue is availability, so it's going to be really difficult to find. It's difficult for the fine fescue growers in Oregon, where the seed is grown, to get good seed yield, so it just hasn't been a major part of the fine fescue market over the years. This, however, does have a couple of important attributes. One, it's pretty shade tolerant, but another one is it has good salt tolerance. So its good low input characteristics along with salt tolerance make it a really good roadside grass. So if you have a site near a road where you get some salt spray, or near a driveway where you get some salt spray, that can be a really good option. So the next few slides I have some pictures showing differences in leaf texture. So I just took these the other day at our research plots to kind of show you, and remember this is during the summer, so you're going to have a few dead leaves that are showing up in these pictures. But this shows you the differences in leaf texture of these grasses. So Kentucky bluegrass, a little wider leaf texture. Hard fescue, very fine, kind of a wispy look. One thing that some consumers don't care for is it sometimes kind of lays over, gets a swirly appearance. So that is kind of a personal preference thing. But overall, hard fescue provides a very nice turf with very fine leaf texture. The other fine fescues would look very similar to this. Perennial ryegrass, I found the very best perennial ryegrass plot on campus. So I wanted to show you the leaf texture. However, this is rarely how it looks during the summer. Usually it has a lot more problems. It gets crown rust and has a lot of dead and dying tissue in it. But the perennial ryegrass is kind of intermediate to Kentucky bluegrass and fine fescue for leaf texture. And then you can see the big difference is with tall fescue. So the tall fescue is a much wider leaf than these other grasses. But if you look back at the Kentucky bluegrass, you can imagine how well Kentucky bluegrass and tall fescue would mix together in a turf. That might be a good idea, for instance, if you wanted the drought avoidance characteristic of tall fescue, so you don't have to water, but you would want some Kentucky bluegrass in there in case you had some ice cover damage to fill in those, help fill in those spots and not have bare spots in the spring if you only use tall fescue. So now I'll go through a series of slides that just lists a rough order of the tolerances of these grasses to some common lawn stresses. So wear and traffic tolerance, tall fescue and perennial ryegrass are the best. That's why we see them oftentimes on athletic fields. Fine fescues are probably the worst for this. It's going to vary between the fine fescues a little bit, and breeders are doing a lot of work to improve this. But overall, it is the lowest in terms of ranking for wear tolerance currently. So if you had a site which got a lot of wear, just repeated continual wear, like a busy park or something, you'd want to stay away from just using only fine fescue. Mentioned before, perennial ryegrass is very quick to establish. Not only germinate quickly, but establish quickly. Kentucky bluegrass can be quite slow. This is of course from seed that I'm referring to here. Kentucky bluegrass can take maybe a week up to 3 weeks to germinate sometimes, whereas perennial ryegrass might germinate in 3 or 4 days. Shade tolerance, we've been doing a fair bit of work at the university. Dr. Dominic Petrella in our group has been working on this. The fine fescues are clearly the most shade tolerant of these grasses. And if you've got a lawn that you want to be low input and you've got a lot of shade, you really need to consider fine fescues as a major component of the mixture you use. If you don't, you're going to end up with bare spots, and you're going to be fighting trying to correct those bare spots, which is going to lead to more inputs. So within the fine fescues, there's some differences, as I mentioned before. So Chewings fescue and strong creeping red fescue seem to be the best for foliar shade tolerance, and hard fescues seem to be the worst. But one thing that hard fescues do quite well is grow with limited amounts of water. So under trees, oftentimes the turf is competing with the tree roots for water, so hard fescues can do okay in that situation. So that's why we usually recommend mixing them together. Classifying these grasses based only on disease resistance is quite tricky because there's a lot of diseases, a lot of nuance. But in general, in Minnesota, tall fescue and fine fescue get fewer diseases than Kentucky bluegrass and perennial ryegrass. This is a big one in Minnesota. Of course, we have if we have a winter with a lot of snow, we don't get a lot of winter damage. But in winters, when we have fluctuations in temperature, or a lot of open periods of open cold, at times when the snow's not there and we have open turf exposed to the cold, we can get a lot of winter damage. Kentucky bluegrass, really no winter problems. Fine fescues do have a few problems under ice, specifically Chewings fescue. We can run into problems if there's extended ice cover, like maybe if there's a month or more of ice, you might run into some problems with the Chewings fescue. Tall fescue, once again, ice is a problem with tall fescue. The other problem with tall fescue is if you seed it in the fall and then you don't seed it early enough. So let's say you seed it like mid-September and it's not quite mature going into winter, you can lose some turf there in the winter. And perennial ryegrass is by far the worst of these grasses for winter. Here's a good picture showing the difference in winter performance between perennial ryegrass and fine fescue. So once in a while, a collaborator will send the wrong seed, so we planted some fine fescue in a perennial ryegrass trial. And you can see all these perennial ryegrasses do not look good after winter, and the fine fescue is doing just fine. And that's a good example of the contrast you can see. Now, this doesn't happen every year, but this is a really good example of the differences in performance for winter hardiness between these two grasses. So if I was going to classify drought tolerance, this kind of includes drought avoidance with tall fescue. Tall fescue probably stays the green the longest in Minnesota. Fine fescue next, then Kentucky bluegrass depending on the variety, and then perennial ryegrass is the worst of the grasses for drought tolerance. So thinking specifically about the topic of this webinar series, tall fescue and fine fescue should really be prioritized when thinking about selecting grasses for low input lawns. So at the university and at other institutions like ours, we test grasses for drought tolerance so that we can understand the mechanisms behind drought tolerance, so we can breed better grasses, develop better grasses that can be delivered to the consumer. And also, we want to screen varieties and make sure that the things that we can give you recommendations on the grasses you are using in your landscapes. So there's 3 ways we can do this. One is we can just not irrigate, and that's the most common thing we do. However, in Minnesota, we have quite a bit of rain during the summer, so that doesn't always give us a lot of good data. So we rarely irrigate our turfgrass plots, and and that sometimes gives us some data on drought tolerance, but very rarely. The other thing we can do is prevent rainfall from reaching our plots. So one way we do that is through something called a rainout shelter. So we've got, it looks like a little greenhouse, and it slides down these tracks and covers the plots that we want to keep the rain off of. So we'll do that. Maybe we would test these grasses in this trial for 60 to 75 days without any rain. This allows us to grow the grass in a real environment, in soils outside, while still preventing rain to get on the plots. And this rainout shelter, which is also pictured here, you can see some grass under the rainout shelter, is remotely controlled. It has a rain sensor, so it knows if it rains, it can sense the rain, and then it can move over the plots. The third way we can do this is through what's called deficit irrigation. I won't get into the details of this, but we can estimate how much water grasses use through a series of equations, and the amount of water that leaves a turf grass, either through transpiration through the plant or from evaporation from the soil, is called evapotranspiration. So we can estimate how much evapotranspiration is occurring in a turf grass stand, and then we can replace a certain percentage of that evapotranspirated water. And we try to replace as little as possible. So we call that deficit irrigation, because we're replacing only a portion of what is being used. So the National Turfgrass Evaluation Program, which is a national group that coordinates trials of turfgrass cultivars, turfgrass varieties, those are the things you go buy at the store. They fund trials all over the country. And one of the trials they fund is the drought tolerance trial, and we have a location here in St. Paul. And in this trial, we're looking at Kentucky bluegrass and tall fescue. So seed companies sent in a number of Kentucky bluegrass and tall fescue varieties, and we're comparing them for performance under different levels of irrigation. So one level of irrigation was no irrigation, so we're not replacing any of the evapotranspiration, or ET. Then there's another treatment that's 25% replacement, and another one that's 75% replacement. So 75% replacement would be a very well-watered control in our case. Here's a view from above of the plot area. So there, you can kind of see there's 9 testing areas here, and each of those testing areas has its own irrigation controller. So we can tell each we can program how much water goes into each of these little sub-trials plots. And then three of these plots would get 25% ET, 3 would get 75% ET, or evapotranspiration, and then 3 of them would get no irrigation. And here's an example. This photo's a little bit washed out, but it's hard to, it's very stark. So you can see, and this is the Kentucky bluegrasses at the 25% level. So that's the kind of medium level. It's, there's a level below that with no irrigation replacement. The 25% level, the Kentucky bluegrasses in general just look really poor. You can see there's hardly any green tissue. The green tissue that is here is weedy grasses or some tall fescue that's moved over from the tall fescue plots. Mostly they look pretty dormant and pretty poor. You can see the tall fescue plots, they're showing a little bit of stress. This was taken on August 6th, and we had been dry there for a while. But you can see pretty much the plots are full. They're green, they're full. They look like they're maybe slightly stressed, but not very stressed at all compared to the Kentucky bluegrass. And in this case, it's an example of choosing the right species, the right grass for your site is very, very important. More important than finding the best cultivar, the best variety to buy. Now, there is a lot of data out there and a lot of possibilities for figuring out which variety you should purchase, and that can be important, especially for certain stresses. And we do have resources on our website about how to think, what are the steps you should take to buy grass seed, what are the things you should look out for. But in general, the first step is to make sure you're using the right species for your site. So like I said, once you've decided, you're going to make this move, you're going to move to a more low input grass species, maybe you're going to convert from your existing grass to something like a fine fescue or a tall fescue. You need to decide where you're going to purchase that grass seed, and you need to figure out which varieties or cultivars you're going to buy. So cultivars are, plant breeders develop cultivars. It'd be a bunch of plants that are intercrossed usually, that look similar and perform similarly. They produce seed then that is going to be perform in a way that's characteristic of that population of plants. And when you go to the store, you're going to buy a variety. So the variety is going to have a name like Midnight Kentucky Bluegrass or Rebel 4 Tall Fescue, let's say. So there's places to get data on grass seed. We do a lot of cultivar testing here at the university. There's testing all across the country. There's testing through the National Turfgrass Evaluation Program. We'll put these links on the web page for the the webinar series. Once you've figured out where you're going to purchase your grass seed and which grass seed you're going to use, you need to seed. We're getting very close to an ideal seeding time here in Minnesota. Usually the state fair is a good time, so late August, early September. You probably want to be finished by, depending on the grass you're planting, you want to be finished by about September 10th. Dormant seeding also works quite well. So dormant seeding is when you seed grass after it's too cold for the seed to germinate, but before the soil has frozen, and then it pops up in the spring, and you don't have to worry about working the soil in the spring, things like that. So in Minnesota, generally, we can't give you an exact date, but the 10th to 15th of November would be a pretty good target. If you want to seed in the spring, that's okay, but you're going to be competing with a lot of weeds. So spring seeding often leads to a lot of weed problems because many annual weeds in Minnesota are also germinating at the same time as you're trying to grow grass. For best practices for turfgrass establishment, which are beyond the scope of this webinar series, you can go to the University of Minnesota Extension page where there's a number of good articles about how to establish a lawn. I mentioned mixing and blending earlier, so you're not going to often just buy one variety of tall fescue or one variety of Kentucky bluegrass. You're usually going to mix multiple species together. So we call that mixing. You might mix a tall fescue with a Kentucky bluegrass. And when you take two or more cultivars or varieties, those terms are the same, synonymous. When you take two or more cultivars of the same species and put them together, that's called a blend. So when you do that, you get the advantage of complementary tolerances. So maybe you've got one grass that's really good in terms of some disease that you have a problem with, let's say dollar spot during the summer. And then another grass that's really good for wear tolerance, maybe, and you combine those two, and then they kind of balance out so that when one of the stresses comes in, it doesn't wipe out the entire stand. It provides really good genetic diversity is what it's doing. One of the problems is it's very difficult to find good performance data on mixtures. So I said before you should use data whenever possible, but mixture data is hard to come by. Hopefully we can do a better job of that in the future. Here's a couple of examples of fine fescue mixtures that would work well. So let's say you've got a low input lawn situation and you've got a lot of sun. Hard fescue at 60% by weight, chewings at 20, and strong creeping red fescue at 20% would be a good mixture. If you've got the inverse, you've got more shade than sun, then you want to flip that so that you're focusing more on species that have more shade tolerance. So chewings fescue at 60%. Strong creeping red at 20, and then you'd still have some hard fescue. So like I said before, it can still do okay under shade because of its ability to perform well under drought conditions, which could occur with tree root competition. So in summary, we've got a number of options in Minnesota. Really think about some of the attributes of these grasses I've mentioned today when thinking about converting to a lower input grass species. In terms of reducing water use on lawns or performing adequately during summer stress periods so you don't feel tempted to turn on the irrigation system, tall fescue and fine fescues are grasses that I would really encourage you to increase the use of in Minnesota. And when you mix grasses together, you can really provide better resilience against things like stress or wear tolerance or disease. That's all I have today. Like I said before, we'll put some resources on the event page for the webinar series, and now I'll be happy to take some questions.
Okay, so our first question is, with longer types of grasses and lawns, so I'm assuming they're meaning more of a low input or a low mow type of situation, do you then have problems with rodents and other pests in your house?
It's a good question. I guess we haven't done any research to identify how many get in the house, but in a no-mow situation, you're going to have more risk of rodents, right? And especially like during the winter, you might have some problems with voles and things like that. So that would be a risk. So I showed a picture of a very no-mow situation early on. Most people aren't going to use that in their home lawn. You might see that at a golf course in an out-of-play area or a park area sometimes, but that would be a risk. The higher the mowing height, there's more habitat area there for wildlife.
Okay, so the next question is, I am 99% sure I have a tall fescue lawn due to the way the lawn comes out of winter. Standing ice, water, it gets those patchy, dormant looking spots. How would you recommend reseeding this, and with what type of mix should I be looking for?
So if it is tall fescue and you want to, if you're somewhat happy with it during the summer, during its summer performance, what you might be able to do is start to incorporate something else. So maybe you could, if you're happy with the tall fescue and the way it looks, otherwise, you might want to add some Kentucky bluegrass this fall just through overseeding, so that you wouldn't have to kill off the lawn, but maybe you have some aeration under your lawn to open up some space, some holes in the lawn for good seed to soil contact, and start adding some Kentucky bluegrass to kind of give you a little more resilience against the ice damage.
Okay, the next question. Is there a difference in the season that various turfs should be planted?
So that's a good question. In general, no. We typically recommend they should be planted in the late summer, early fall, really late summer technically. The one exception is tall fescue. So because I mentioned this briefly, tall fescue, sometimes when it's a little young going into winter, we will see more damage. So in the case of tall fescue, you might think about either dormant seeding or seeding it in the spring. You can seed it in the fall, but just make sure you're seeding it on the early side of the seeding window. So like if I was going to seed a tall fescue lawn, I would probably think about seeding in the next week or so, just to make sure, falls have different lengths of growing seasons. And if we have a short fall like last year, you might run into some problems if you wait much longer.
Okay. I have patchiness in my yard with areas of Kentucky bluegrass and areas of fine fescue. Not sure what type. I prefer the color and texture of the fescue. How can I encourage the fescue to spread over more of my lawn and eventually take over the areas that are currently Kentucky bluegrass?
So that is an approach you can use. What you try to do is you manage for the fine fescue to thrive. So depending on the situation you have, I would imagine things like don't water your lawn, don't apply a lot of fertilizer. Those are steps that should help to increase the chance that you have fine fescue thriving. Oftentimes you'll see the patchiness because the fine fescues will thrive in the shady areas and the Kentucky bluegrass in the sunny areas. And now that's a tricky one to manage against because shade is something you're not going to do a whole lot about. But generally, just don't put a lot of inputs into the lawn, and the Kentucky bluegrass should then slowly be outcompeted by the fine fescue. One issue you might have is if there's not fine fescue throughout the lawn, you might have to overseed some of that into the existing Kentucky bluegrass stand.
Where can we get more info on bee lawns?
So we've done a lot of work in collaboration with the Bee Lab here at the university on bee lawns, and we will also post a link on the resource page, on the event page, to the Bee Lab website. And almost all of our content on bee lawns, including the mixtures you should use and so forth, are on the Bee Lab website, and we will post that link after the webinar.
What fertilizer should be used on fine fescue lawns?
So the type of fertilizer isn't so important as the amount. So, there's lots of different fertilizer products you can use. But with fine fescues, once they're established, they don't need a lot of it. So they need, depending on your soils, you might assume a pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet per year, maybe applied September 1st, let's say. So really all you have to worry about is that. Now you might want to make sure that you're not using only a slow release product. So some fertilizers release very slowly after they're applied, some release very quickly. And if you go to that extension website that we'll link on the event page, there'll be more information about fertilizer types. But the main thing to remember with fine fescues is they don't need a lot of fertilizer. Fine fescues don't need a lot of anything. They need a little bit of fertilizer. They need to be mowed once in a while. You don't want to be mowing them when it's hot. Just leave them be, and they'll do just fine. And fertilizer is a good example where they need a little bit of fertilizer, and you want to take a soil test to understand how much phosphorus and potassium they might need. But in terms of nitrogen, just a little bit every year, maybe half as much as you would give Kentucky bluegrass or something like that.
You had a chart near the end showing more sun than shade versus more shade than sun. Can you show this again? If I have large areas of shade and large areas of sun, should I have two different mixes?
So if you have both situations, you don't necessarily need both mixes. So I would kind of pick the one that you have the most of. So if most of your lawn is best represented by the list on the left, go with that one. If most of your lawn is best represented by the list on the right, go with that one. I wouldn't switch the mix based on that, because like I just in the previous question I answered, the grasses that are more adapted to the environment in which they're planted will thrive there and kind of push the others out. So I think you'll see the population kind of shift according to the environment it's in, if you just use the same mix throughout.
Okay, which types of fescues are best suited to integrate into flowering bee lawns?
So almost all of our flowering bee lawn recommendations. So for those of you who don't know, bee lawns are it's when you take flowering plants that can be mowed. Some like clover can be mowed, right? And you incorporate them into a low input lawn. And usually this is sold as an entire package. So you would buy the seed for the grass mixed with the flowering species. And we've done research on which species to use and things. The fine fescues do quite well in bee lawns because they're not terribly aggressive. So they coexist better with the flowering species. Kentucky bluegrass can also work. We found that tall fescue is not a good option just because it really outcompetes the flowering species and it's tough to maintain them. But we've had the most luck with fine fescues.
Okay, the next question has been partially covered, but I'll say it. How do I encourage hard fescue to overtake a Kentucky bluegrass predominant lawn?
In the case of hard fescue, for sure, don't water. That's going to be your main advantage there. Hard fescue, don't spray pesticides. Hard fescue does really well without any pesticides and without any water. Now, if we had a really severe drought, you might want to water, but in general, a typical Minnesota summer, don't water that hard fescue, and the populations of Kentucky bluegrass will be reduced.
Okay, so the next question. Some mixtures in stores have way more tall fescue in the mixture when compared to Kentucky bluegrass. Is there a reason for this?
Yes, so when you do a Kentucky bluegrass tall fescue mixture, you actually want a lot of tall fescue. You probably want the percentages to be something like 90 or 95% by weight tall fescue. And this is because there's two reasons. One is if you put too much Kentucky bluegrass in the mix, it's going to outcompete the tall fescue. And the second reason is Kentucky bluegrass seed is much smaller. So when you're dealing with an amount by weight, each pound of Kentucky bluegrass is going to have a lot more seed than tall fescue. In fact, Kentucky bluegrasses might have 1.5 million seeds per pound, something like that, while tall fescues might be more like 200 or 250,000. So you can see there's a big difference in number of seeds per pound. So when you talk about weight, you'd want about 90 to 95% by weight tall fescue.
Okay, the next question. Is there any harm in not fertilizing a lawn? I'm concerned about runoff and I don't care if I have a beautiful lawn.
Yeah, you don't have to fertilize your lawn. Returning clippings is a good practice. You might want to keep an eye on it though. And I've had fine fescue lawns for years, and sometimes I won't fertilize it during a year. Do it the next year. You might want to keep an eye on it and see if it looks like it could use a little more, a little fertilizer, once in a while. So you might fertilize it every 2 or 3 years. The problem with not fertilizing at all, though, especially if you have a soil that's not very doesn't have a lot of fertility, is that you can end up with bare patches. And usually people who are concerned about, who want to reduce fertilizer use are also concerned about environmental effects. And one of the problems with bare patches in your lawn is it's going to increase the runoff of the soil. And actually that's more of a problem than if you would have fertilized properly. So if you fertilize properly, make sure your fertilizer's not, going on your sidewalk, things like that, not over applying, putting the right amount down. You're not going to have the environmental issues that you're worried about, but you will have a healthy lawn that can hold that soil and reduce phosphorus from running off into our water and in our lakes.
Okay, we still have a little more time for questions. So if you want to get your question in, do it now. So this next question is, where is the best location to get Chewings fescue and what should you expect to pay?
That's a good question. So Chewings fescue is a tricky one. You need to call around a little bit. So there are seed suppliers in town who supply this to retailers. So maybe you could contact some of those suppliers. We do have a resource page on our turf website that lists a few options for where you might be able to find seed. I'd call around. Higher end greenhouses might be one option where you can find more availability. But for bigger projects, sometimes farmers co-ops have pretty good seed availability or the ability to find seed. That's been one of the challenges with fine fescues. Is just how, I'll say hard fescues are great, and the question is where do I get them? We've seen more and more availability though over the years, so you're gonna have to kind of keep digging around. There's some online places you can get seed as well. Cost is going to vary. It's going to be more expensive than you're probably used to. The fine fescues are usually a little more expensive than, quite a bit more expensive than something like perennial ryegrass, for instance. But the advantages of paying extra for that seed are quite tremendous in terms of not having to mess around with reseeding because your lawn died during the winter, or having to apply extra fertilizer, which can be a costly thing as well.
Okay, that was the last question. Thanks, everyone. There's a lot of great questions today.
Thanks.
So just a reminder, everyone, thank you for joining us, and be prepared in 3 weeks for our next webinar, which will be talking about lawn care best management practices. We'll look forward to seeing you then.